Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. I swear this wasn't intentional, but I think this is now our third department head in a row from the American Enterprise Institute. On the last episode, we had Matt Continetti. Shortly before that, we had Michael Strain. And now, of course, we have the best department head.
Of course, yes. You're making your way through the management team. I admire your pluck.
and Yuval Levin, people already recognize his voice, is not necessarily the most frequent guest on this podcast, but he is easily the most frequently quoted guest on this podcast. And he's also the head of my department, which makes him more important than Strain and Continetti combined, squared and cubed. So Dr. Levin, welcome back to the Remnant.
Thank you very much for having me, Jonah.
So we're recording this on Wednesday morning, and the big news was late yesterday. Claudine Gay of Harvard University resigned from the presidency, not from the faculty, and at Harvard. And I have to say the degree to which the mainstream media, and as you know, I've been trying to wean myself on obsessing about media criticism for a very long time. I think it's the lowest form of punditry. But the desperation to turn this into a conservative's pounce story has been really kind of remarkable. And the desperation from people like Ibram Kendi and Al Sharpton and other people has been to Nicole Hannah-Jones to make this part of a racist mob, and this is all about racism. Has been really kind of remarkable. It seems to me that the story here is to get meta about it is in part the inability of sort of both sides have this problem of just not taking the loss, right? Just saying we lost on this one because we deserve to. Like, how do you look at this whole thing?
Yeah, look, I think it's amazing. First of all, I mean, I think that if P.J. O'Rourke or Chris Buckley wrote a book where the president of Harvard turns out to be a plagiarist, you'd have to say that's a little too on the nose. That doesn't even count as social criticism. And yet here we are, and I think the most painful kind of the most damaging sort of vice that an elite can have in a democracy is hypocrisy. Is seeming not to live up to the standards that an elite insists on for the larger society. And you just can't imagine a clearer example of that than what we've seen in these elite universities in the last few weeks, beginning with them suddenly turning around on free speech when the speech involved is anti-Semitic speech, and then continuing to essentially defending plagiarism at the very highest reaches of the American Academy. I think it's just an almost unbelievable level of hypocrisy here, and they really do have to cut their losses and say, look, this person just shouldn't be president of Harvard, quite apart from anything else that's going on. But obviously, in this moment, nobody's capable of saying the fault is with our own side in this case, and instead, we always have to look for ways in which actually the people we hate are responsible. And you see it. I mean, as if the problem here is the pointing out of plagiarism or the picking out of this one person, like everybody does it. That's been a theme too. Of like, well, what are we going to go and look at everybody's record now and check them for for plagiarism? Well, yeah, I think we are. I mean, that's kind of what academics should be doing anyway. So I think you're trying to force people on the left are trying to force this into a box of left right when in fact this is an unbelievable level of a failure of fundamental academic responsibility, and Harvard should just own it, hard as it is.
Yeah, I mean, I find it particularly weird. I mean, as you know, I'm not normal. I'm going to start co-founding the Dispatch with Steve Hayes, a Columbia Journalism School graduate, so we take his views very seriously about journalism with a capital
J. Yes, very august.
I've had to sort of take more seriously in the last 10 years the role of press and journalists in a free society and yada, yada, yada. And but I am I'm incapable of understanding why it's so difficult for journalists in particular to understand that motives don't necessarily matter, right? I mean, the most famous whistleblower, most famous journalistic source of the last half century, maybe last century, maybe ever, was Deep Throat.
Right.
And when he was finally revealed, it turned out that he wasn't horrified by Nixon's abuse of the Constitution.
Yeah.
He was a jerk who felt like he'd been passed over for a promotion and was ratting his colleagues out. And he was actually a kind of a cranky right-wing schmuck. And that doesn't make the Woodward and Bernstein Watergate reporting any less valid, right? And like, how many whistleblowers have, like, whistleblowers have their own motives for all sorts of things. How many major political scoops in this country every week are driven by opposing campaigns with oppo research? And yet, when it comes to things like this, it's got to be conservatives pounce. Conservatives are taking a scalp, and for academics as well. I mean, Charles Freed at Harvard Law said he would take these allegations seriously if they weren't coming from these whack jobs. Now, I'm fine with saying that some of these people are whack jobs, but that doesn't mean they're wrong about the plagiarism. The plagiarism is the plagiarism.
You know, some of the most important kind of systems of the liberal society are meant to turn bad motives to good. And particularly in this way of guarding against abuses by creating incentives for people that are often low incentives to go out and seek misbehavior. That's especially true actually in the academic world, where certain kinds of competitive incentives exist to make sure that that person making that claim can actually prove that claim. And in some ways, in relation to this motive question in politics, the best place to look is Federalist One, which I read with students every summer. It's not one of the sort of familiar major Federalist papers that everybody reads, but it's Hamilton's introduction to the debates about the Constitution. And among the things he says is pointing out the fact of low motives or of personal interests just doesn't get you very far, because lots of people on the right side of important questions have bad motives,
Right.
just as lots of people on the wrong side. So all you're proving by saying people have bad motives is that they're people. You aren't really proving anything about the actual claim they're making. And so let's put aside let's accept in advance that everybody involved here is a human being, and ask what really are the facts. And the facts here just can't be defended.
Yeah, and there's just one other thing. And I know it's not your job to do media criticism, thank God. But I've now heard it in NPR. I've heard it on all sorts of cable channels. I've read it in the New York Times. They keep talking about these plagiarism allegations, right? Now,
Right.
the mainstream media is not qualified. Your average reporter, you both of us can easily concede, is not qualified to make an independent judgment about all sorts of technical public policy issues, right? I mean, like whether or not a nuclear reactor is safe, whether or not something violates the law of war. You got to go to experts. But the New York Times is one of the few institutions out there that actually has a considerable amount of expertise about what qualifies as plagiarism, right? It's not she was accused of misgendering a poet in the 14th century, right? I mean, like, you got to go call someone to get an answer to that. But like, the Times, if it wanted to, could look at these allegations itself and say she committed plagiarism. I mean, we had this massive debate about whether or not you should use the word lie about things that Donald Trump says.
Right.
Like, they decided in a sort of a vision of the anointed kind of way that they were qualified to decide whether to not use the word lie. Plagiarism is a kind of lie. It goes right to the heart of the journalistic enterprise. And yet they're just these allegations out there. Someone else will have to get to the bottom of them.
And it's worth really looking at the details here, because what she did was repeat verbatim, maybe moving a word or two, entire paragraphs of very arcane kind of academic writing. There's just no way that
Right.
that is not plagiarism. I mean, I would say if you were to try to articulate an idea, the same idea, on two separate days of the week, you'd have trouble coming as close as she did to the exact word for word writing of somebody else. There's just no way that this was not knowing and intentional plagiarism.
So let's broaden it out because, I mean, one of the frustrating things about this whole story is that plagiarism is actually one of these really easy topics, particularly for elite universities that pride themselves on scholarship.
Right.
It's
We're
uh,
against it.
right. They're supposed to be against it. It's supposed to be one of these easy things. They have like whole handbooks about it, and so like the getting to the hypocrisy point, it's kind of maddening because it's an easy case, not because it's a hard case,
Yeah.
right? But more broadly, I've written a lot about it. A lot of our colleagues have written a lot about it. This, I mean, basically, a big chunk of what my book "Suicide of the West" was about was this. We'll just use it as a placeholder label, even though all these labels kind of get flawed. Of whether you call it cultural Marxism or wokeism or settler colonial theory or oppressor theory, whatever.
Yep.
But the sort of, I think I like Wesley Wang. He had this great term for it, which was replacement ideology.
Yeah.
Because it kind of because it's kind of like constantly updated what you're supposed to call it. But how new do you think it is, right? I mean, and or what is new about it compared to the political correctness kind of stuff that we dealt with when we were in college, or the
Yeah.
sort of cultural Marxism of 1960s and 70s, or critical legal theory? Is it all the same idea, just with different emphases, or is there something truly new to it?
Well, I think they're very much related. So I would say that at least since the end of the 18th century, there's been an ideology in the West that wants to view the world as divided into what we might call now oppressor and oppressed, or just weak and strong.
Right. Exploiter and
And
exploited in the
yeah,
Marxist phrase, right?
the
Yeah.
way to understand the movement of history is to see that it's all about the relationships between the strong and the weak, and justice is the protection of the weak. It's not a crazy way to think. It becomes crazy when it's your only way to think. But I think you see versions of this, starting with the kind of radical Whiggism of the 18th century. You certainly see it in Marxism, where the weak and strong are understood in economic terms. Then they come to be understood in kind of political power relations. And we are looking now at a way of understanding them in race terms. That's not quite new either. So I think, broadly speaking, if you step back far enough, this certainly is a version of what the left has been for as long as it has made sense to talk about left and right. The left thinks in terms of strong and weak, the right thinks in terms of order and chaos. And those are useful categories. They're not, they don't explain the particulars of any political situation all that well, but they explain the general framework, I think, very well. In that sense, this is familiar, but it does take different forms in different times. And I think that the peculiar kind of racialist form that it has taken in the last 15 years is very strange. That's not what political correctness was fighting, not exactly. And it's not what the kind of radicalism of the middle of the 20th century was all about either. It's almost entirely shorn of economics, so that you can still call it Marxism if you want to. I think I get what people are saying when they say that, but it's missing what was the essence
Right.
of Marxism, because it takes almost no interest in economics, in part because it is a way for people who are quite wealthy to describe themselves as the weak in society, or to align themselves with the weak. And rather than thinking in economic terms, it thinks in these kinds of groupish, tribal terms and racial terms. But I think the categories that we've used to understand the dangers of radicalism, of the left in the last 200 years, are useful for understanding this particular thing. They don't get you the whole way, but this is a version of what the left has been. I don't think it's entirely new.
Yeah. I mean, one flawed metaphor for all sorts of ways occurs to me, because I don't like medicalizing politics, but it's kind of like COVID variants,
Right.
right?
Right.
It's the same basic disease, but the spike proteins look different on each each iteration and each version.
Yeah, I think seeing the basic framework is helpful because it lets you see that left and right do still matter. I mean, today's right is still recognizably the right, too. It is worried about social order, it is worried about outsiders invading. That's always been a kind of element of the right's way of understanding political questions. And the left's way of thinking in terms of weak and strong, oppressor, oppressed is also still relevant, even though the ways in which these are different do matter. This moment is different.
It just reminds me because I've been on a bit of a reevaluation. I used to be pretty opposed to horseshoe theory,
Hmm.
and I recently wrote my end of year column for LA Times was about how I 2023 was the year I kind of abandoned my opposition to it. Not in the totalitarian sense. I always thought, that was the point of liberal fascism to a great degree,
Right.
was how both Nazism, Bolshevism were heresies of socialism. And I've always believed that. But my problem with it in the American context was always that, particularly on the right, for obvious reasons, American conservatives, the American right, has deep, deep reservoirs of liberalism to it, right? A lot of our most passionate commitments, at least at the time when I was writing this and for the preceding 80 years, were things like free speech, individual rights, free markets, limited government, free trade to a lesser extent. That always catches people unawares. All sorts of property rights, gun rights, right? Things, negative constraints on the government, all that kind of thing, and also we on the right tend not to appreciate it, but the left actually has a whole bunch of very strong liberal commitments, or anti-statist commitments, in the
Right.
sense of, I mean, what is defund the police other than
Yep.
radical, anarchism, right? And
Yep. A lot of social liberalism too.
right, and so this idea that somehow the radicalism of the left and the radicalism of the right would become indistinguishable just didn't work in the American political tradition. But now that I see the sort of the statism of the way that the left has become so much more illiberal in recent years, and the right hasn't become, I mean, you make a case that it hasn't become as illiberal as part of the left, but it's become as a
Yep.
regret, as a all increases from zero or infinite, right? So like the increases on the right are much more noticeable and disturbing to me for all sorts of reasons.
Yeah.
But as a proportion of where they were, the right has become very illiberal. A lot of these, do you know what time it is?
Mhm.
Red Caesar garbage argument stuff, the common good constitutionalism thing. And from where I say, I'm with Calvin Coolidge in the 4th of July speech.
Right.
Whether you look right or left, if you're moving towards illiberalism, you're moving down slope. And illiberalism's all identitarian illiberalism looks the same to me, at 30,000 feet, whether it's right wing or left wing. Where do you come down on all this? I probably should have asked before I wrote the
Well,
column.
I think I agree with everything you say there, and I think that illiberalism is one way in which the differences between left and right have been muddled, to say the least, in the last 10 years or more. I think there's also another way, which is that along with the left right axis, it's sometimes useful to think in terms of an insider outsider axis about our politics. And the party of the right at any given time is naturally more at home as the insider party. It's the party that cares about social order, wants to defend the institutions, and so it kind of claims ownership of the society. The left wants to protect the powerless from the powerful, so it's kind of naturally an outsider party. And for most of the 20th century, the left was the outsider party, the right was the insider party. I think in the 21st century, we've lived through a kind of switching of roles there. I always think
Mm-hmm.
of Lincoln's image of the two men wrestling each other into one another's coats. And the right today is the outside party. It's the party that thinks of itself as beset by the institutions, as living in a corrupt society and trying to bang on the windows from the outside to be heard. The left is, although it doesn't acknowledge it so much, the inside party, the party that actually runs all the institutions. The president of Harvard is obviously very much a person on the left, and the next one surely will be too. And so the parties have kind of switched places on the inside outside axis in a way that I think creates a horseshoe almost unavoidably, because they meet in those places where the left is not comfortable being the inside party and wants to still be the revolutionary and the critic. And so it kind of sounds like the right sometimes these days, and where the right is not comfortable being the outside party.
Hmm.
And I would say I'm a person of the right, not comfortable being the outside party. I want to defend the institutions, and defend the liberal society, and that sometimes creates some strange alliances now of left and right, because the right is just naturally inclined to be more inside, the left more outside. And so you have these kind of cleavages now and slippages of left and right. So I think there's more to horseshoe theory now than there has been for most of my lifetime, because the left and right have switched places in this way. So that maybe we've talked about this before, but I think there's a way that, for example, when a party in a democracy loses a really close election, as both of our parties have lately, um, it comes up with stories about why it happened. So the inside party will say something like, the Russians stole the election, some
Hmm.
nefarious outside force. The right would have said that for most of the 20th century. Now the left says it. The outside party comes up with some kind of Noam Chomsky theory about how the elites who run the institutions of the government and the elites who run the corporations got together to silence the people. That would have obviously been the left for most of our lifetime, and it's now the right. That kind of slippage naturally points in the direction of horseshoe theory. It just leaves people on each side sounding like people from the other side. And I think there's just a lot more of that now than there's usually been.
Yeah, it just. We've obviously talked about this before. I know I've talked about it on here before. One of my favorite essays is the Samuel Huntington Conservatism as an Ideology essay from 55, 57, something
Yeah,
like that.
57.
And, part of his point, which again, it's on the bingo card, but is that conservatism and radicalism are the only two ideologies that are really, truly, purely contextual. And that a conservative in one kind of society with certain kind of precepts is going to be conserving very different institutions than a conservative in another kind of society. And similarly, a radical, whatever society they're in, they just want to tear down whatever institutions they see around them.
Yeah.
Um, and it just seems to me, it turns out that the rhetoric of radicalism really doesn't know an ideology. Yeah, when it comes to like racial valences or that kind of stuff, it's it it can take on a different dialect kind of thing, but it's still the basic same language, right? It's the
Yeah.
same kind of rhetoric, same kind of framing. Our institutions are corrupt; they need to be torn down. Anything would be better than this. Um, Sometimes that's the correct description of reality. If you live in North Korea,
Yeah. That's right.
There are lots of things that could be worse than this.
I've always thought of that Huntington essay as being, in a way, about inside outside more than about
Yeah.
right and left. Because there is substance to right and left, in a liberal society. They really are two ways of thinking about what liberalism actually is. Um, but it's also very true that there's always an inside and outside, and that the inside just kind of feels like the right because it says this society is great, we run it, we need to protect it from threats. The outside kind of feels like the left because it says this is all corrupt and needs to be torn down. But people's reasons for making those arguments can vary in a way that I think, isn't simply about conservative and progressive. Those terms, I think, do have a meaning. They don't get you all the way to the bottom of anything, but they actually are substantive.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe I'm going to argue with you on this. As you know, I was a big fan of your book, um, The Great Debate, and I've borrowed from it. This thing I've looked. I don't think it's actually in the book, but it's something I heard you say about the book, about how you judge sometimes you should judge movements by their metaphors.
Right.
And so the thing about Paine is he comes from this tradition of movement towards the future, right? And we're all marching as a unit to the future together, and therefore you have to keep the stragglers in line, and we're all going in a singular direction. And Burke's metaphors are about space, right? It's sort of the English
Exactly.
garden versus the French garden, and all that. And
Yeah, conservative movement has always struck me as a contradiction, as an
right,
oxymoron.
right. And so I think that that's a real human thing, right? This idea of we're all in it together. We all have to go to the same place together. There's no room for disagreement. I've been saying for 15 years now, the most fascistic thing that's normally said on every college campus is, if you're not part of the problem, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem, right? That's very unconservative.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's not about space. It's violating space. It's basically saying there's no safe harbor. You have to agree to this, overriding ideology. I think that's real. I think that gets at something real. And if we want to call them left and right, I think that's fine, and good or useful. But do you think left and right are useful terms, heuristics, prisms, regardless of the society that you're looking at? And are you not then imposing a lot of baggage on some societies that don't necessarily fit these? I mean, go to Sudan. I don't know what left and right mean, right?
Yeah, I think politics is always contextual in that sense, in that very broad sense. There is such a thing as comparative politics, but it's not actually the same as what what a genuine political science does for its own society. So there certainly are terms that are just going to be useful within a certain kind of framework. Now, I think the liberal framework now is widespread enough that you can identify a left and a right in most democratic societies. Certainly in Britain and America, and the English speaking world, where these terms came from and where they really belong. But I think you can identify a left and a right in Europe and in Japan or in Israel in ways that do align, or at least make sense somewhat of the categories. But these terms, these concepts, come from our own political tradition. They come especially from the English political tradition, and so they're particularly useful in explaining that tradition and in
You think the
guiding
right and left
the
come
life
from
of
the
that
English
tradition.
tradition?
I do. I think the right and left come from the English way of describing what was happening in France.
Okay.
Um,
I was trying to figure out how you're getting across the channel. Okay.
yeah, I mean, I think that what made the Age of Revolutions revolutionary was especially the Anglo-American response to the French Revolution. Obviously, the French Revolution itself was a very important event in the history of the world, but it was given a framework in the English speaking world that then transformed that world in much more constructive ways than anything that happened in France. The English party system went from being a division over whether the king or parliament should rule to a division about how society should meet the future as a result of the ways in which the French Revolution was processed and understood in the English political debate. And I think left and right become meaningful terms in that process, and especially in Britain and America. It's actually, it's a way of thinking about the purpose of theory in politics. I think there's a tendency. You've talked about this actually a lot in the last few months on the remnant. So there's a tendency sometimes, especially when people like me, whose education is kind of in political theory, to talk about politics as if it is just applied political philosophy, as if
Mm-hmm.
ideas have their own momentum. But I think that there's a better way to think about what theory is for, is that theory begins as diagnosis, and if it's effective diagnosis, it can become prescriptive. So that if it properly explains our situation, then it becomes how we think about what we ought to do. And I think that's how left and right happened. They began as ways of trying to understand what was happening not only in France but in the liberal societies of the English speaking world, and then became ways of making decisions and choices. It came to structure how we think because it was useful for explaining what was happening. And that's really how theory works. I think that's the way in which you can say the response to the French Revolution had an effect on the political evolution of Britain and America, and I think it did.
So that's very interesting to me because I mean I think you're right. I would just make it much more conditional in the sense that that's the way theory can work,
Right.
right? Because sometimes the theory plays catch up with events, and sometimes the events are shaped by the theory. And um, I was talking about this a bit lately. The role that Darwinism had on the 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 particular nature of Nazi ideology, right?
Yeah.
And um, that there was this move to essentially change metaphors from broken souls to disease,
Hmm.
right? So, like anti-Semitism, it's bringing coals to Newcastle to tell you something like this, but anti-Semitism has been around for a while,
Right.
right? What was novel in the late 19th, early 20th century was the importation of these uh, scientific and medicalized terminology, the Darwinian language about um, everything's a contest for survival,
Yeah.
and the constant talking about body politic. Thomas Leonard's great on this in his Illiberal Reformers book. And when you believe the old Catholic anti-Semitism said that you could save Jews by saving their souls by getting them to embrace Jesus. If you believe that no, they're actually a parasitical non-human species, you don't care about their souls, right? And um, so ideas sometimes can have
Absolutely.
transformative effects that make events different, and then sometimes
Well, I think
the horse
that's
and the cart
true,
keep
but
changing places at different times in different contexts. Is I guess what I'm
yes,
trying
I
to say.
think that's right. But that to become influential on practice, theory has to first be persuasive as an explanation of something that it did not create. And so it becomes powerful by being a persuasive description, even a theory that means to change the world, right? If you look at the Communist Manifesto, it starts by explaining how things ended up the way they have in Europe. And it only becomes persuasive as a guide for action if it is first persuasive as an explanation of what has happened in the past.
Mm-hmm.
And in that sense, I think it's important to see that theory, to begin with, describes events and plays catch up. That's what it does, that's how it works. And only then can become an influence on events, so that politics is not fundamentally applied political theory. Theory is first of all diagnostic. The power of the Darwinian metaphors, and Darwin's an interesting example actually, because in some ways Darwin was doing this himself. You can find Darwinian concepts before Darwin
Mm-hmm.
in political theory.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, you find them in Edmund Burke. He didn't have the language of Darwin, but he's describing evolutionary change.
Mm-hmm.
And that set of metaphors was useful to Darwin himself. But the power of his theory was that it was explanatory, and in a way that felt like a revelation. And you often have to remind theorists and students of theorists that the theory did not create the practice. John Locke did not invent England.
Mm-hmm.
He was describing and offering an explanation for how things came to be that existed in the world, and its being persuasive then also played a role in how the world changed. So I think it's absolutely true that people consult these kinds of philosophies when they think about what to do. I mean, I've myself been present in rooms where people said, well, we're Americans. We believe everybody's equal, so we should do this and not that. Or we're Republicans. We're against taxes. That's a way in which theory guides practice. But the theory, I think, does begin by describing practice. It's actually a useful way to think about some of the ways that our politics now is under-theorized. I think one problem with 21st century politics is that in the arenas where the social sciences tend to be most useful to policymakers, especially say macroeconomics and foreign policy, they're now not useful because the theories are not good descriptions of contemporary reality. Contemporary macro was created to explain the Great Depression and to avoid another one. And it's actually not a very good explanation of 21st century economics. And Mike Strain's going to rush in here any minute and burn us down. But I just think macro now is not very good at describing some of the basic patterns of 21st century economic life. And there's a need for new theory. And similarly, a lot of international relations theory was created by academics to describe the Cold War world. And there's not been another generation of theorists like Sam Huntington, you mentioned before,
Hmm.
in the post Cold War world to try to describe that for all kinds of reasons of incentives in the academic world and that kind of thing. It just doesn't make sense now to be this sort of generalist theorist in these areas. And there's a palpable absence of theory in some of our political debates now, where things happen in the world and there's no theory of America's role in the world to fit them into, or everybody's kind of watching the economy and we're always surprised by everything because we don't have a good framework, which is really what theory gives you. And so I think political theory and economic theory is very, very important, but it has to be understood, I think, first and foremost as a diagnostic tool and then as a prescriptive tool.
So I think I agree with you, and I think this is very interesting. But I don't know if this is pushing back or just asking for uh, expansion and explication. But it seems to me that a lot of let me put it this way. I think it's a really interesting take to say that a lot of our problems stem from the lack of theory. When if you had asked me 10 minutes ago, I would have said a lot of our problems stem from an excess of theory.
Yeah. Well, look, they're both true. I mean, there's a lot of bad theory. And I wouldn't say really a lot of our problems stem from a lack of theory. I think there are some distinct problems
Fair.
that particularly trouble policymakers now, where in the past, theory and academics in general have been unusually useful to politicians. So you think about where have academics been important in American government in the last 100 years? It's been economists, where we're just used to seeing Harvard professors become advisors to presidents, and foreign policy, where again we're used to seeing Harvard professors become advisors to presidents. And in both of those fields now, because of what's happened in the academy, there's a lot of hyper specialization. There's not a lot of generalist theorizing. And what happens in those arenas now is just not very useful to policymakers. Um, and, I think of that as an opportunity for think tanks, among other things. You need people who actually see it as their role to bridge academic work and public policy because academics themselves don't see it that way. But these are two areas where I do think we lack theory somewhat. I wouldn't say that's true in general. I mean, there's probably more social theory than absolutely necessary in our politics at the moment. But theory does give you useful diagnostic frameworks. And this is a moment that calls for diagnostic frameworks. I think we are living in a time that is hard to understand. And there's a tendency to sort of jump into action without really getting a sense, getting a grasp on what is happening in our society. And that is true in social theory, too. It's true in constitutional theory. I think a lot of our institutions are under stresses that are not well understood. And some of what people like us at AI and a lot of our colleagues elsewhere are trying to do is to offer some frameworks first for thinking about what's the nature of this problem that then can become useful for addressing it, for dealing with it. And I do think it's a moment that's where political and social and economic theory are actually exceptionally useful. There are good and bad theories, and there are a lot of bad ones out there now. But I think in some ways we do lack frameworks for understanding this moment. I mean, that's part of why it's so disorienting.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. And I like the point about theory properly understood should be diagnostic first. I agree with that. At the same time, you know, I spend way too much of my time reading people trying to impose
Yep,
intersectional theory into everything, right?
absolutely.
And
The theory's
um
got to be persuasive as diagnosis. It
well,
can't just be a bunch of nonsense.
but that's this is where I have problems, not with you, but with the theorists, right?
Yeah.
Or with an emphasis on theory, insofar as, like, just this morning I was reading these tweets from these left-wing MDs talking about how we need to really question the presence of so many Zionists in medicine, in American
Uh-huh.
medicine, because they're a threat as believers in an apartheid and racial supremacy. They're a threat to health equity. And um, not to sound too much like Archie Bunker, but I think a large number of people, all things being equal, would prefer to have a Zionist doctor, a Zionist lawyer,
Uh-huh.
a Zionist accountant, and not to traffic in grubby euphemisms. But no, like that kind of thinking.
Yeah.
So this get so, like we people. There are some people, I guarantee you, are listening to this who are like, I want to hear another 4 hours about theory, and then there are other people saying it feels like we've already had 4 hours of theory. So, but this gets at something that we were chatting about a little bit before we began. I am increasingly, and you sort of mentioned this briefly. I'm increasingly of the view that there are very few new ideas in politics and sociology or social political affairs, right?
Yeah.
And on net, talking about ideas as if they're new ideas is more dangerous than helpful, because if you tell someone, oh, this is the old idea of socialism, well, then I know what the arguments are. I have access to the arguments against socialism. But if I say there's this new idea called loveism, which has all the policy elements of the old socialism, but it's got a better brand and better packaging, it first of all, it gives people who want it to be true permission to skip all the old criticisms, because, oh, that's old, this isn't that, this is something new. And it also gives the opponents of it reason to come up with all sorts of new rationales to fight it in ways that they think the old ways don't matter anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, like, I keep the thing always pops into my head about this is this guy who's the chairman of the board of the Claremont Institute, who had this big thing about how we have to support Trump because he's the only one willing to take on this new ideology of woke communism.
Right.
And when you have this catastrophist sort of framing of this new idea, it gives the opponents of it permission to use new methods, when in fact I think the old methods are of persuasion, argumentation, debate, elections. These are still the better methods, rather than, sort of weightlifting and talking about secession. And so when I look around, this idea of identity politics is a very old idea. It's a very tribal idea. The idea of corporatism, or nationalism, socialism, all of these ideas are very old ideas. And it's very rare will I will encounter something that someone says is a new idea in politics, when at best they're describing a new mood,
Right.
and not a new idea. So what is your response to that? Do you think
Yeah.
there are a lot of new ideas in politics?
No, I certainly do. I'm a conservative, so I think very little has been learned since St. Thomas finished compiling the connection between Aristotle and Judaism and Christianity. At that point, we basically knew a lot of what we're ever going to know.
Mm-hmm.
You add to Aristotle's ethics and politics the insight that God created the heavens and the earth, and you got a lot of what the West is ever going to be. I do think there have been new ideas in politics since then. I think liberalism, properly understood, is a new idea that is a very good idea. Now,
I
it's
agree.
not new anymore, but it's newer than classical politics. It was an innovation that was genuinely that opened genuinely new vistas in the human experience, and was fantastically worthwhile. I also think that there have been bad innovations since that time. Totalitarianism was not the possibility of it was not evident to classical philosophy. But I think it's worth
Well,
distinguishing what's
I'm curious about that. I really want you to finish your thought, but there's an old argument about Plato's Republic sort of laying the groundwork for totalitarianism, and even
yeah.
Rousseau's groundwork.
I
I mean,
think that argument is not that old. The that is, it's not as old as Plato's Republic.
mhm,
I don't actually think it's quite right that Plato's Republic envisioned that kind of. There's a weird kind of anti-Platonism, and Karl Popper and various other things that sort of see in the Republic the absolutism of 20th century totalitarians. I just don't think that's right.
okay,
I certainly side with Aristotle where he disagrees with Plato, but as Karl Popper does. But I don't think that it makes sense to see the seeds of Maoism in Plato.
mhm,
Um, so that in some ways totalitarianism was a reaction to the innovations of liberalism more than
mhm,
it was an extension of anything older. That's a long story, but I do think that where there aren't a lot of new ideas, the closer you get to human nature, the fewer new ideas there are going to be. So that in ethics, I really don't think that there's been much new. I don't think a lot of contemporary academic ethicists are saying anything that the sophists were not saying, and that Plato and Aristotle did not disprove decisively in the fourth century BC. There just isn't a lot new there, and the basic descriptions of human nature that we have from classical philosophy and from the religions of the world remain as true as they've ever been. As you move away from human nature in the direction of sociology, there are some innovations. As you move from that in the direction of politics, I do think you see genuine experimentation that is new. Economics, I think the market economy really wasn't available as a concept or a practice in the classical world. So there are new things, but ultimately, a lot of the divisions and debates we have really are about human nature. And therefore, there aren't new reasons why socialism might work next time. It's not going to work next time because the reason it doesn't work is very deep in that durable soil of human nature, which is not changing. And so we can try all kinds of new things, but to the extent that they are well aligned with what we are as human persons, they will be successful at making us happy. And to the extent they're misaligned, they will be disasters. And I think that old idea remains as true as ever, and it's going to be the way in which every new idea is tested.
yeah. I mean, I think that's very well put. I do think getting back to sort of my point about sort of settler colonial theory, whatever we're going to call that, right? Or anti-Zionism, or intersectionality, or all these kinds of things. One of the hallmarks of populism, going wherever you want to put the starting date on populism, right? Uh, um, and I think you can't because it goes back to telling the
Yeah,
tribe what they want to hear, right?
right.
But um, that's the essence of a lot of bad theory, is telling audiences what they already want to hear and what they secretly believe but want permission to say out loud. And um, you look at the people defending Claudine Gay right now, and it is just too comforting not to tell people this is all about racism, even though she's the second university head to step down from that committee. The first one was
Right.
not black, um, and similarly, the most of the clever theorizing about um, uh, trans stuff, I think a lot of it has to do with. I was just started reading this thing before we came on. That a big chunk of it just simply has to do. It's sort of reference. I made a reference to a similar phenomenon about how when the left had the Gramscian march through the institutions, they didn't want to stop marching. Right? They just need causes to be obsessed with. And when you got gay marriage and you basically got social acceptance of homosexuality in this country, it's not like those organizations that got it were like, okay, now we can close up shop and become accountants. They needed some other thing to be fighting for, and they picked this new cause. And it seems to me that a huge amount of theory, even a lot of the stuff that passes for the new stuff on the right these days, is, first of all, A, old, but B, it's just basically telling audiences, telling constituents, telling factions everything that they want to hear to justify their political agendas. And I think in a populist age, aided by social media, aided by this sort of the breakdown of institutions, which obviously you've written enormously about, there's very little theory I see out there that isn't really theory. It's just it's marketing for a lot of cosplay, more than anything else.
Yeah, I think that's right. I largely agree with that. I think a lot of what is new on the right isn't new, and isn't even particularly new for the right necessarily, but that it is a way of trying to describe, of trying to sort of backfill theory for what is politically convenient. It's not true of everything on the right, and I do think that some of what the new right is about is a reaction to some of the excesses of the prior version of the right, is a genuine reaction to some excessive libertarianism of late 20th century conservatism. The trouble is that it very quickly reaches into a kind of pre-conservative right, which is not at all new and which speaks to some of the instincts of the American right, but doesn't speak very well to this moment in American life. I mean, I think the striking thing about this time in our politics is that so little of it is about the future. So little of it really talks about what America needs to be in 2040 and 2050 in ways that are at all persuasive or engaging, or that really seem to be about that future. I don't think the left or the right is doing a very good job of that. And to me, that suggests that neither of them is really engaged with reality in a way that is working to make sense of it in this moment. And it's part of why our politics looks and feels the way it does.
Obviously, I could do this forever, but and if people hear some banging in the background, Yuval did warn me in advance that he's got some workmen in the house.
Sorry about
that. I hadn't heard it until just a minute ago, so just letting people know. But Adam will do yeoman work and get rid of it. I just had Continetti on. We did pretty rank punditry. But I figured I would get your take on some of this as well. I just wrote my LA Times column about how I think that part of the problem with that Nikki Haley is encountering, and by no means do I think Nikki Haley is the perfect candidate or by any stretch of the imagination. And if Ron DeSantis had taken off, I would have been happy to have Ron DeSantis be the nominee instead of Donald Trump. I would have probably preferred Nikki to Ron DeSantis, but not by a lot, whichever. I'm basically for the field, with the exception of Vivek Ramaswamy, but who just landed this morning the coveted Steve King endorsement. But it seems to me the part of the problem that Nikki faces in particular is, and it sort of fits the stuff that we've been talking about for a very long time about weak parties, breakdown institutions, is she's just actually a good politician. And I mean that in a positive, praising sense, is that she thinks about political questions as a politician, and as a politician should, which is like, what can I get away with? How far can I go in this? Who do I need to bring on board? How can I persuade people? And I think the reason why her kerfuffle about not mentioning slavery at that town hall had to do with the fact that that normally healthy approach got the better of her, and she overthought the situation and stumbled a bit. But it's funny if you go back and you think about, Bill Clinton. I had my problems with Bill Clinton. You had your problems with Bill Clinton. He was a great politician. And he thought about, how do I build my coalition, not how do I shrink my coalition?
Right.
And it seems to me that that's the defining problem in Republican politics now is the only legitimate way to build a coalition is blind loyalty to a single personality. And other than that, wheeling, dealing, compromising, dealing with politics, not as the crow flies, but as it is seen as inherently corrupt. And I don't know how you get out of that.
I think it's very true. There's a way that politics itself now, the basic core work of politics, which in our system unavoidably is coalition building, is understood to be a kind of insiderist corruption. So that, we punish a Speaker of the House when he makes deals with Democrats, which is kind of his job. We think it's wrong for political elites to work with each other to arrive at deals that can take on public problems, which again is their job in our system. We've come to think that coalitional politics that's aimed to grow, to expand the coalition, is a betrayal of core voters and some kind of betrayal of principle. And that means that we understand politics itself to be corrupt, to be illegitimate. There's a long tradition of understanding politics to be corrupt. It is not a good tradition. It is not a healthy tradition, because the alternative to politics, to a kind of coalitional politics of the liberal society, is no good. I mean, the alternative to that kind of politics is a politics of force and coercion.
That's where the real horseshoe theory is real, right?
Right,
exactly.
Exactly.
That's the language of Marxists and fascists alike, right?
That's right. And I think for the moment, what this is leading our politics into is a series of failures of coordinated action and collective action, which leaves everybody in our politics standing on the side as an observer and commenting. Nobody is comfortable being the insider and saying, we're going to act together. We're going to have a meeting. We're going to talk about what we want to do, and then we're going to do it together. That seems like it's somehow illegitimate. And so instead, I'm going to stand on my own on the side and criticize and observe and complain and be a pundit. It's certainly evident in the primary in the Republican Party now. It's evident on the left too in different ways. You see congressional staff writing letters, public letters, anonymously against their bosses, or the White House staff protesting Biden's policy on Israel in Gaza. These people who work in the White House actually go outside and protest, like with candles and signs. It's nuts. They don't even see how this is the epitome, the embodiment of the craziness of this moment in our politics, that these insiders feel like in order to actually be effective, they have to be outsiders. They have to literally go outside the building and protest. That is not a way to be effective, right? The White House ignores protesters. I mean, there's protesters every day about something or other, and you walk by them on the way to work where you actually make decisions. And yet there's this kind of confusion on all sides about what is involved in political life. Is it speaking against the way things are going, or is it acting in a way that influences where things will go? And losing that distinction, or failing to see which in fact is politics, is one way to think about what's happened to 21st century American political life.
Yeah, when those letters started coming out from the White House and all that stuff, my initial reaction shows you how deep in my head you've gotten. Is like, I was like, oh my God, this has got to have Yuval pulling out his hair. I know it's too late for that, but still.
Yeah, if I had any left, I sure would have. My initial reaction was, well, obviously they're all going to be fired now. And of course, there was not even any consideration of doing that. They obviously should have been fired that moment. It's amazing that they were not.
So just to bring this round back to higher ed, and then I promise I'll set you free. When I have you on the podcast, it's the only time at AI I'm allowed to order you around, so I kind of relish it. But I see I remember I wrote, it's now become a little bit of a cliche, but I think I was one of the first people to write this 15 years ago about how a lot of mainstream progressivism was, you always judge political movements by their utopias, right? Or at least utopian movements by their utopias. What is it, what is the perfect afterlife look like, right? And so for
Right.
Marx, it's hunting in the morning and writing poetry in the afternoon and all sorts of BS. And um and it seems to me that for a certain slice of elite college attending progressives, it's to make American life like a vast college campus, right? Or possibly Canada, right? But basically, the idea is like campus values of not hurting people's feelings, of self-exploration, self-expression, all of these kinds of things. The I wrote this long before DEI was a thing, but the sort of DEI values where it should be society's values, all that kind of stuff. And I think that one of the problems that we're seeing today is that, everyone wants to talk about the immigrants at the border, but in a lot of ways, the immigrants to society who are having the most profound effect are the ones who come from the land um, of campus Shangri-La, right? Where they bring this, because I think one of the biggest mistakes that higher education at elite schools, because I don't think it happens at like the University of Missouri to any great extent, is this idea that somehow the real point of a college education is to be dragooned into or enlisted into essentially protest culture of oppositional culture to institutions of it's like how many once you look for it, you see it everywhere. It's that it's considered a rite of passage, that this is part of going to college, is being a protester about something. And it gets at this insider outsider thing. And I think a lot of these young people, they go to Capitol Hill, they go to the White House, they go to corporate America, they go to the New York Times Slack channels, and they bring with them this idea that they're not being sufficiently heard. And I think that's a bigger problem of why we have dysfunction in a lot of elite institutions, is because they think they're still in a position of power vis-a-vis administrators and professors at these institutions that want to encourage this kind of cosplay. And you can't run an institution where the kids think, the young staffers think that they really should be seen as in charge in some significant cultural way.
Well, I think that's right. It's particularly bizarre when the way in which they think they ought to be in charge is still, as we're saying, a kind of outsiderist way. The only way that they can think about power is by way of standing outside and yelling at the system. The strength of that kind of position in society is that you can speak truth to power. The weakness of it is that you have no power and no responsibility. The trouble is, we now have people who have a lot of power and a lot of responsibility trying to behave as though they are just speaking truth to power.
Right.
Actually, having power comes with certain constraints. And what they're really doing is rejecting those constraints. They're trying to have the power without the constraints. And there's a word for that. It's irresponsibility. It's recklessness. And, that is now what a lot of American institutions look like. Those people working in the White House, they have a lot of power, but they work under a constraint, which is when the boss makes a decision, it's your job to carry it out. Well, they still want the power, but they want to evade that constraint. When the boss makes a decision, they want to be part of the protest against him. Nothing can work that way.
Right.
And I think when we lose sight of the fact that institutions give us roles, give us jobs to do that come with both benefits and constraints, then nobody's doing their job. And, that's not a bad way to describe what our politics looks like now.
Yeah, it does make you, it's a great daydream to think about what James Baker would do.
Yeah. I mean, those people would have been fired before they came back in the building.
Yeah, they literally would not have been able to get, their badges would not work anymore.
Right.
All right, I'm going to let you go, but a couple of weeks ago, I was supposed to give a big plug for the summer honors program, and I kind of forgot, and then I did it on a solo thing, but people were traveling. Since you are one of the linchpin professor type people of the summer honors program. Do you want to give a quick plug about what it is? And I will.
Sure. So AI's Summer Honors Program is a program that brings undergraduates to Washington for a series of classes with AI scholars and also with others, with academics from around the country. You have a great choice of courses. I am teaching a class this coming summer that I think is going to be called Progress and Tradition, and that will work through the tension between progress and tradition in modern liberal societies. It's also a kind of case for the liberal society. But you've got classes. Mike Strain is teaching a course on just the market economy and how to understand it. There are AI scholars teaching about China and about the Middle East. There are outside scholars teaching courses on a range of things from political theory to American history and others. It's a great way not only to learn a lot, but also to meet other young people who share your interests. It is not an intellectual monoculture. It certainly leans right, but there are people with all kinds of views among the students in these groups. And my sense is that they have a huge amount of fun and also learn a lot. So it's really worth your while.
Yeah, I've never met a kid who did it who didn't appreciate doing it, and then usually after they eat all of their spinach with people like you on the last night or the second to last night, they usually bring people like me and Styrwald in, and we do human geek tricks.
Well, that's what they're really there for.
All right, Yuval Levin, thank you so much for doing this. Greatly appreciate it. And
thanks very much, Jen. I always enjoy it a lot.